The alarm clock buzzed at 4:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Emily Carter needed to wake up. She'd trained herself to beat the sound, a small victory in a life that had been stripped of larger ones. Rolling out of her narrow bed in apartment 3B, she moved through her morning routine with military precision. Shower, coffee, toast, no newspapers, no morning shows. The less she knew about the aviation world beyond Fort Rucker's gates, the easier it was to pretend she belonged on its periphery. By 5:45 a.m., Emily was crossing the Alabama base in pre-dawn darkness, her civilian contractor badge catching the glow of security lights. At 35, she'd perfected the art of invisibility. Blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, unremarkable clothes, eyes that never lingered too long on the Apache helicopters lined up on the flight line. She was Emily Carter, flight systems technician. Nothing more, nothing less. The woman who'd once been Lieutenant Carter had died 8 years ago, along with her father. The simulator building stood apart from the main flight operations, a concrete monument to virtual warfare where pilots learned to kill without dying. Emily's keycard beeped her through the security door, and she flipped on the lights to reveal her domain. 6 full-motion Apache simulators worth $12 million each, and the small office in the back corner where she'd spent 7 years, becoming a ghost. Her morning ritual began with diagnostics. Each simulator required a complete systems check: hydraulics, computer processors, visual displays, weapon systems simulations. She moved between the machines with practiced efficiency, noting maintenance needs, adjusting calibrations, ensuring that when the Golden Boys arrived at 800, their virtual war would run flawlessly. But Emily's real work began after everyone left. Hidden behind her computer monitor was a photograph she thought no one had noticed, a younger version of herself standing beside an AH-64 Apache, flight helmet tucked under her arm, face bright with the confidence of someone who believed merit mattered more than politics. She'd kept it there for 7 years, a private reminder of the life she'd almost lived. What the photograph didn't show was the wooden box locked in her apartment, containing her father's pilot wings and the dreams they'd once shared. Colonel James Carter had been a legend, Desert Storm veteran, decorated combat pilot, and the man who'd taught his daughter that flying wasn't about proving you belonged in the sky. You simply belonged if you had the skill to stay there. Flying isn't about gender, he told her during one of their weekend flights in his civilian helicopter. It's about instinct, precision, and courage. You have all 3 in abundance, Em. Don't let anyone tell you different. Those words had carried her through flight school, through the sideways glances and whispered doubts, through instructors who seemed determined to find her breaking point, right up until the day everything broke anyway. The malfunction during her final qualification had been real, a targeting computer failure that could have happened to anyone. But when Major Robert Hadley's voice crackled over the radio, loud, enough for everyone in the control tower to hear, Emily knew her flying career was over before it had truly begun. This is exactly why women shouldn't be flying combat aircraft. You get flustered under pressure and start hitting buttons at random. The investigation had cleared her completely. The computer malfunction was pre-existing, documented in maintenance logs that no one had bothered to address. But damage, once done, has its own momentum. 2 weeks later, her father died in a helicopter crash caused by another maintenance oversight. The timing felt like more than coincidence. Grief-stricken and facing increasing hostility from certain quarters, Emily had accepted a medical discharge that everyone agreed was best for all parties. She'd spent 3 years in Atlanta, working aviation administration and dying a little more each day before something called her back to Fort Rucker. Maybe it was unfinished business. Maybe it was just the inability to fully let go. Now, as she finished her morning diagnostics, Emily heard voices in the hallway. The day shift was arriving early, something about a new training protocol being implemented. She glanced at her watch. 7:15 a.m., 45 minutes before her official invisibility began. "These new combat scenarios are going to separate the wheat from the chaff," said a voice she didn't recognize. "Half these kids think flying an Apache is like playing a video game." Emily moved closer to her door, listening. "That's the point," replied another voice, older and carrying the authority of senior rank. "Better to wash them out here than have them crack in actual combat. Though I still say nothing in a simulator can replicate the real thing." The voices were getting closer. Emily quickly returned to her desk, pulling up maintenance logs on her computer screen, but her ears stayed tuned to the conversation. "The targeting scenarios alone will eliminate the weak links. I've run the numbers. We're looking at a 60% failure rate minimum. Good. The Apache program isn't a participation trophy. You either have what it takes or you don't." Emily frowned at her computer screen. She'd seen the preliminary data for the new training protocols, and something bothered her about the calibration parameters. The scenarios seemed designed less to train pilots than to break them, a subtle but crucial difference that could have long-term consequences for combat readiness. But that wasn't her job anymore. Her job was to maintain the equipment and stay invisible. As the voices faded toward the main simulator bay, Emily caught herself staring at the photograph again. The woman in that picture wouldn't have stayed silent. She would have spoken up, offered her expertise, fought for what was right. But that woman was dead, buried under 8 years of careful obscurity and the weight of dreams that had turned to dust. Emily Carter, flight systems technician, pulled her maintenance logs closer and continued her work. After all, someone had to keep the machines running for the real pilots. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same hands now calibrating simulators had once been steady enough to land an Apache in a sandstorm. But that was then. This was survival, and survival, she'd learned, required staying invisible until the day you couldn't anymore. The new sheriff commander, Paul Wilson, arrived at Fort Rucker on a Tuesday morning with the kind of reputation that preceded him like storm clouds. Emily first heard his name in whispered conversations between instructors: naval aviator, decorated combat veteran, multiple deployments, and, according to the rumors, a man who believed the modern military had gone soft on standards. Wilson's old school? She overheard Captain Marshall telling another instructor. Word is he thinks half the pilots coming through training wouldn't last 5 minutes in real combat. Maybe he's right, came the reply. Some of these kids have never seen anything. Tougher than a video game. Emily kept her head down, adjusting parameters on Simulator 3, but she filed the information away. In her experience, commanders who arrived with something to prove usually did so at someone else's expense. She got her first glimpse of Wilson that Thursday. Tall, silver-streaked dark hair, and the kind of bearing that screamed career military out. From across a crowded room, he moved through the simulator bay like he owned it, which Emily supposed he essentially did. As the new director of advanced training protocols, Wilson had carte blanche to reshape the Apache program according to his vision. That vision, Emily would soon learn, had very definite ideas about who belonged in a cockpit. The first incident happened on a Friday afternoon. Emily was recalibrating the environmental response systems when Wilson entered Simulator 2 unannounced. She looked up from her laptop, startled by his sudden presence. Who authorized these modifications? His voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to immediate answers. Emily straightened, her hands automatically smoothing her civilian contractor shirt. Sir, these are standard calibrations required for the new training protocols. All changes were approved through technical services according to regulation. "The sensitivity settings are too high," Wilson interrupted, moving closer to peer over her shoulder at the screen. "The candidates will be dealing with false positives in the threat detection systems." Emily knew he was wrong. The settings were precisely calibrated based on the latest field data from combat deployments. But something in Wilson's demeanor, the way he loomed over her, the dismissive tone, triggered memories she'd spent years suppressing. "With respect, sir," she said carefully, "these parameters accurately reflect the current operational capabilities of the AH-64E model. Anything lower would create an unrealistic training environment that could—" "And you would know this how exactly?" Wilson's eyes narrowed as he took in her contractor badge, her unremarkable appearance. "Last time I checked, technicians maintain equipment. They don't make decisions about training parameters." The familiar burn of dismissal spread through Emily's chest. How many times had she heard variations of this same conversation? How many ways could she be told that her expertise didn't matter because it came wrapped in the wrong package? She began. But Wilson had already reached past her, manually adjusting the settings and reducing the sensitivity by 30%. "There. Now it's usable." He straightened, dismissing her with a glance. "Stick to your lane, miss." He paused to read her. "Name badge, Carter. Leave the aviation decisions to those who actually fly." After he left, Emily stared at the screen, watching the parameters she'd carefully calibrated being overwritten by settings that would make the training scenarios dangerously unrealistic. She could fix them, of course. Wait until Wilson left for the day and restore the proper calibrations. But doing so would be noticed eventually, and then there would be questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Instead, she saved Wilson's modifications and made detailed notes in her maintenance log about the specific changes and their potential impact. If pilots started failing scenarios due to unrealistic system responses, at least there would be a paper trail showing why. That weekend, Emily found herself doing something she hadn't done in years, calling her father's old friend, General Patricia. Hayes, now retired, but still connected to the aviation community. "Emily?" Patricia's voice carried surprise and warmth. "Honey, I haven't heard from you in ages. How are you holding up?" They talked for an hour, about Emily's quiet life at Fort Rucker, about Patricia's grandchildren, about everything except the reason. Emily had really called. Finally, as the conversation wound down, Emily found her courage. "Patricia, what do you know about Commander Paul Wilson?" A pause. "Wilson, he's got a solid record. Good pilot, tough standards. Why?" "He's taking over the Apache training program here." "I was just curious about his background." Patricia's tone shifted slightly. "Emily, Wilson's competent, but he's also traditional in his views. Very traditional. If you're working around him, keep your head down and do your job. Don't give him any reason to notice you." The advice stung, but Emily understood the subtext. Men like Wilson didn't just dismiss women's expertise, they actively resented it as a challenge to their worldview. "I understand," Emily said quietly. "Do you?" "Because knowing you, honey, you're going to want to speak up when you see problems. And, with Wilson, that could make things very difficult for you." After they hung up, Emily sat in her small apartment, staring out at the base lights in the distance. Patricia was right, of course. The smart move was to keep her head down, do her job, and let someone else worry about training protocols. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw those modified parameters and imagined pilots struggling with scenarios that bore no resemblance to actual combat conditions. She saw young aviators like Lieutenant Rodriguez, who she'd watched perform admirably despite Wilson's flawed calibrations, failing tests that should have been challenging, but fair. Monday morning brought news that made Emily's stomach clench. The first group of candidates would begin training under Wilson's new protocols that week. the same protocols running on the simulators with his modified parameters. As Emily ran her morning diagnostics, she made a decision that would change everything. She opened a new file on her computer and began documenting every discrepancy between Wilson's settings and actual Apache performance characteristics, every modification that deviated from manufacturer specifications, every potential safety issue his changes might create. She told herself it was just good record-keeping, standard maintenance protocol. But deep down, Emily knew she was preparing for war. The only question was whether she'd have the courage to fight it when the time came, or if she'd fold again when faced with the full weight of institutional power. Outside, her office window, the morning sun climbed over Fort Rucker, illuminating rows of Apache helicopters that seemed to mock her with their silent presence. Somewhere among them was the aircraft she should have been flying, if the world had been fair. But fairness, Emily had learned, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival meant staying invisible, at least until invisibility became impossible. The reckoning. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning that started like any other. Emily arrived early, ran her diagnostics, and settled into her routine of invisible competence. The first training group under Wilson's new protocols had been struggling for 2 weeks, failure rates approaching 70%, with candidates washing out of scenarios that should have been challenging but achievable. Emily had watched it all from her monitoring station, taking careful notes as pilot after pilot failed to adapt to the unrealistic system responses Wilson's modifications had created. She'd seen promising aviators like Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez struggle with targeting systems that lagged far beyond actual Apache specifications, their confidence eroding with each failed attempt. That morning, Rodriguez was scheduled for her final qualification attempt. Emily had worked with the young woman's simulator sessions enough to know she was exceptionally skilled, the kind of pilot the Army desperately needed. But under Wilson's flawed parameters, even exceptional pilots were failing. Emily made a decision. For the first time in 7 years, she broke protocol. Working quickly, she accessed Rodriguez's assigned simulator and restored the original calibration parameters, the ones that actually matched Apache performance specifications. It was a small act of rebellion, one that risked her job if discovered, but she couldn't bear to watch another talented pilot fail due to Wilson's ignorance. Rodriguez's session began at 0900. Emily monitored from her station, watching as the lieutenant navigated the complex combat scenario with the precision and adaptability of a natural pilot. Her targeting responses were crisp, her navigation flawless, her emergency procedures textbook perfect. She was going to pass as Rodriguez. Completed the final sequence, Emily felt a surge of vindication. This was what properly calibrated training looked like, challenging but fair, designed to build skills rather than destroy confidence, but her satisfaction was short-lived. Unacceptable performance, Lieutenant. Wilson's voice crackled through the simulator bay's speakers as Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit. Your response time on the targeting sequence was 2 seconds over standard. Emily's blood ran cold. Rodriguez had actually performed better than the established benchmarks if you used the correct specifications. Sir, Rodriguez said, standing at attention, I was compensating for the targeting lag in the system. The actual Apache doesn't respond. With that delay, are you making excuses, Lieutenant? Wilson cut her off, his voice carrying clearly through the facility. Or are you suggesting you know better than your instructors about how an Apache performs in combat? No, sir. The simulation is designed to test your limits, not coddle you with perfect systems. In combat, equipment fails, systems lag, pilots adapt and overcome. Wilson's voice rose, ensuring everyone in the building could hear his dressing down. Unless you think the enemy will call a timeout because your targeting system isn't responding as quickly as you'd like, Emily watched. Rodriguez's face fall, saw the young woman's confidence crumble under Wilson's public humiliation. The injustice of it, watching a skilled pilot being destroyed by a system deliberately designed to be unfair, finally broke something inside Emily that had been bending for 8 years. She stood up and walked out of her office. "Sir," Emily said, her voice cutting through Wilson's tirade. "Lieutenant Rodriguez is correct. The current simulation is running with incorrect parameters. The targeting lag she experienced doesn't reflect actual Apache performance, even under failure conditions. It's a calibration issue I was planning to address." The simulator bay fell silent. Every instructor, every candidate, every maintenance worker stopped what they were doing to watch the civilian contractor challenge the program director. Wilson turned slowly, his expression shifting from anger to cold disdain. "Miss Carter isn't it our simulator technician?" The way he emphasized her title made it sound like an insult. "Tell me, when was the last time you flew an Apache in combat conditions?" The question hit like a physical blow, dredging up memories Emily had spent years trying to bury. "I haven't, sir. But the technical specifications, then I suggest you confine your expertise to plugging in cables and changing light bulbs." Wilson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're a glorified janitor for real pilots, Miss Carter. Don't presume to lecture combat aviators on flight characteristics you've only read about in manuals." Snickers rippled through the gathered instructors and candidates. Rodriguez shot Emily an apologetic look, but remained silent, her own position too precarious to offer support. Emily retreated to her office, her face carefully blank, despite the humiliation burning through her chest. Behind her, she heard Wilson smoothly resume his critique of Rodriguez's performance, his authority restored and unchallenged. But that night, after everyone had left, Emily stayed late and restored the correct calibration parameters across all simulators. It was a direct violation of Wilson's orders, an act of defiance that could cost her the job that had become her only connection to aviation. She didn't care anymore. The confrontation escalated over the following weeks. When Emily's corrections were discovered, she received a formal reprimand warning about overreach of position. When she submitted a detailed report documenting the discrepancies between Wilson's parameters and actual Apache specifications, it was returned with inappropriate input stamped across every page in red ink. When she attempted to speak directly with other instructors about the safety implications of the flawed training scenarios, she was told in no uncertain terms that her technical opinions were neither required nor welcome. The message was clear: know your place or lose it. But Emily had already lost too much to be intimidated by the threat of losing more. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "The measure of a pilot isn't how they handle perfect conditions. It's what they do when everything goes wrong." Everything was going wrong now. And for the first time in 8 years, Emily Carter was ready to fight back. The final straw came during a high-stakes demonstration for Pentagon officials. Wilson had arranged the visit to showcase his revolutionary training protocols, with top candidates performing complex scenarios under the most demanding conditions. Emily was required to stand by for technical support, watching from the back of the room as Wilson presented his program to a group of senior military officials, including General Patricia Martinez, whose reputation for operational excellence was legendary. "As you can see, gentlemen and ladies," Wilson said, gesturing toward the main display, "our standards are uncompromising. Only the very best advance to actual aircraft training." The demonstration began with Lieutenant Michael Chen, one of the program's most promising candidates. Emily watched with growing dread as Chen attempted a complex extraction scenario running on Wilson's modified parameters. The targeting systems lagged impossibly, The threat detection generated false positives, and the environmental responses bore no resemblance to actual Apache capabilities. Chen, despite his obvious skill, failed the scenario spectacularly. As you can see, Wilson continued smoothly, this pilot lacks the exceptional capabilities required for our combat aviation program. General Martinez frowned, studying the data displays. Commander, that scenario seems unrealistically difficult. Those targeting patterns from the hostile forces don't match any deployment parameters we've encountered in theater. Emily felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment she'd been preparing for without realizing it. She could stay silent, preserve her invisible existence, and watch as Wilson's flawed system destroyed more careers and potentially endangered lives. Or she could speak up and accept the consequences. "Ma'am, you're correct," Emily said, stepping forward. "There's a parameter error in the hostile force capabilities. The targeting speed is set 40% above documented enemy capabilities. It's making scenarios impossible rather than challenging." The room fell dead silent. Wilson's face flushed with fury as he turned toward her. "Miss Carter, you are dismissed from this demonstration immediately." "But sir," Emily continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "the simulation is fundamentally flawed. It's training pilots to expect impossible scenarios rather than preparing them for actual combat conditions." "What it's doing," Wilson said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is identifying those with exceptional skills required for combat aviation rather than lowering standards to accommodate mediocrity." He looked pointedly at her civilian badge. "Something someone in your position couldn't possibly understand." General Martinez studied Emily with sudden interest. "May I ask about your background?"
"In aviation, Miss Carter." Before Emily could answer, Wilson interjected smoothly.
"Miss Carter is a civilian contractor responsible for basic maintenance. She has no aviation background beyond technical manuals." But General Martinez was still looking at Emily, and something in the older woman's expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with Wilson's dismissive answer. "Is that correct, Miss Carter?" Emily met the General's eyes and made a choice that would change everything. "No, ma'am, it's not." The room seemed to hold its breath. "Before I was a civilian contractor, I was Lieutenant Emily Carter. I completed the Apache Combat Pilot Program 80 years ago with the highest qualification scores in a decade. I received a medical discharge before deployment, but my training was complete and my knowledge of Apache systems is comprehensive." The revelation hit the room like a concussion grenade. Wilson's expression shifted from anger to shock to something approaching panic. General Martinez stepped closer, recognition dawning in her eyes. "Carter. Any relation to Colonel James Carter? He was my father, ma'am." Understanding spread across the General's face. She'd clearly heard the story, the promising female pilot, the controversial discharge, the decorated father's tragic death. Emily could see her putting the pieces together. "I see," Martinez said quietly. Then louder, "Miss Carter, what specifically is wrong with these simulation parameters?" For the next 20 minutes, Emily presented a comprehensive breakdown of every flaw in Wilson's training protocols. She demonstrated the discrepancies between simulated and actual Apache performance, explained how the unrealistic scenarios were undermining rather than enhancing pilot training, and outlined the potential consequences for combat readiness. She did it calmly, professionally, and with the depth of knowledge that could only come from someone who had lived and breathed Apache systems for over a decade. When she finished, the room remained silent for a long moment. Finally, General Martinez turned to Wilson. "Commander, It appears we need to have a very serious discussion about your training protocols. Wilson's face had gone ashen. General, I can explain. You'll have plenty of opportunity to explain. But first, I want a complete technical review of every simulation parameter in this program, conducted by qualified personnel. She looked at Emily. Miss Carter, would you be available to consult on this review? Emily felt 8 years of suppressed dreams stirring to life in her chest. Yes, ma'am, I would be honored. As the officials filed out, Wilson remained behind, his expression a mixture of fury and defeat. When they were alone, he approached Emily with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. You have no idea what you've done, he said quietly. Emily met his gaze without flinching. I know exactly what I've done. I've told the truth. This won't end here. I'll fight this review, challenge your credentials, question your motives. You do that, Emily interrupted. And while you're fighting to preserve a flawed system that's failing,
Pilots and potentially endangering lives, I'll be doing what I should have done 8 years ago, which is...
Emily smiled for the first time in longer than she could remember. My job. The one I was always meant to do. As Wilson stalked out, Emily remained in the empty demonstration room, surrounded by the simulators that had been her refuge and her prison. For 7 years, the ghost in the machine was about to become very real, and she was done being invisible. The gathering storm, the technical review, began 72 hours after General Martinez's visit, and Emily found herself thrust into a world she'd been excluded from for 8 years. The review team included senior pilots from 3 different bases, civilian technical experts from Boeing and Lockheed Martin, and, to Wilson's obvious discomfort, Emily herself as the primary systems consultant. For the first time since her discharge, Emily wore a uniform again. Not her old Army blues, but the civilian equivalent issued to contracted specialists working with classified systems. It felt like putting on a second skin she'd forgotten she owned. The first meeting took place in Fort Rucker's main conference room, a sterile space dominated by a massive table and wall-mounted displays. Emily arrived early and was reviewing her documentation when Wilson entered, flanked by 2 instructors she recognized but had never formally met. Miss Carter, Wilson said, his voice carefully neutral, I trust you understand the gravity of what you've initiated here. Emily looked up from her files. I understand that fixing flawed training protocols is essential for pilot safety and mission success. What you understand, Wilson replied, settling into his chair, is how to second-guess experienced combat aviators based on theoretical knowledge. Before Emily could respond, the review team filed in. Leading them was Colonel Sarah Martinez, General Martinez's daughter, Emily realized with a start, followed by Major David Chen, no relation to the candidate, a test pilot from Edwards Air Force Base, and Dr. Rebecca Sullivan, a civilian systems engineer from Boeing's Apache program. Colonel Martinez called the meeting to order. We're here to conduct a comprehensive review of the current Apache training protocols, with specific focus on simulation parameters and their correlation to actual aircraft performance. Miss Carter, you've raised concerns about the current system. Please present your findings. Emily had prepared for this moment. She stood and activated the wall display, showing a side-by-side comparison of Wilson's parameters versus manufacturer specifications. The current training scenarios deviate from actual Apache capabilities in 17 critical areas, she began. Targeting system response times are artificially delayed by an average of 40%. Threat detection parameters are set to generate false positives at rates 3 times higher than field data indicates. Environmental response modeling uses weather patterns that exist nowhere in our operational theaters. She clicked to the next slide, showing pilot failure rates. The result is a 73% failure rate among candidates who should be passing based on actual performance capabilities. We're not training pilots, we're breaking them. Dr. Sullivan leaned forward. These discrepancies, they're quite significant. What was the rationale for these modifications? All eyes turned to
Wilson.
He straightened in his chair, his expression defensive. The modifications were designed to create higher stress conditions than pilots might encounter in actual combat. The theory being that if they can succeed under impossible conditions, they'll excel under normal ones. But that's not how pilot psychology works, Major Chen interjected. Training under impossible conditions doesn't build confidence, it destroys it. Pilots need to master achievable scenarios before progressing to truly challenging ones. Wilson's face flushed. With respect, Major, I have 15 years of combat aviation experience, and I have 20, Chen replied calmly, including 3 deployments flying the exact scenarios these candidates are supposed to master. The parameters Miss Carter has identified would make me fail tests I've successfully executed in actual combat. Emily felt a surge of vindication, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't about proving Wilson wrong, it was about fixing a system that was failing everyone. Colonel Martinez studied the data displays. Miss Carter, you mentioned 17 critical discrepancies. Walk us through the most significant ones. For the next 2 hours, Emily presented her findings with methodical precision. She demonstrated how each modified parameter created unrealistic scenarios, showed correlation data between the changes and increased failure rates, and provided detailed technical justification for returning to manufacturer specifications. Wilson challenged her at every turn, questioning her data, her methodology, her qualifications. But Emily had spent 8 years preparing for this moment, even if she hadn't realized it. Every late night studying technical manuals, every unauthorized session in the simulators, every careful note in her maintenance logs had led to this. When the formal presentation ended, Dr. Sullivan spoke first. This is the most comprehensive analysis of training system parameters I've seen in 20 years of defense contracting. The level of detail and technical accuracy is exceptional. Major Chen nodded agreement. The correlation between parameter modifications and performance degradation is clear. We need to implement Miss Carter's recommendations immediately. Wilson made one last attempt to salvage his position. I still maintain that higher difficulty standards produce superior pilots. Higher difficulty standards, yes, Colonel Martinez interrupted. Impossible standards? No, the data is conclusive, Commander. Your modifications are counterproductive to training objectives. As the meeting adjourned, Emily found herself surrounded by members of the review team, all wanting to discuss specific technical points. For the first time in 8 years, her expertise was not just acknowledged but actively sought. Dr. Sullivan approached as the others filed out. Miss Carter, I have to ask, your background suggests you should be flying these aircraft, not just maintaining the simulators. What happened? Emily glanced toward Wilson, who was gathering his papers with the mechanical movements of a man in shock. That's a long story, Doctor. I'd like to hear it sometime. Boeing is always looking for consultants with your level of systems.
Knowledge. After everyone left, Emily remained in the conference room, staring at the displays that still showed her analysis.
8 years of careful documentation, of staying invisible, of swallowing her expertise to maintain her precarious position. It had all led to this moment, but she knew the real fight was just beginning. Wilson hadn't built his career on accepting defeat gracefully. He would push back hard, using every bit of institutional power and personal connection he possessed. Emily had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Rodriguez.
I heard about the review.
Thank you for speaking up. Some of us knew something was wrong but were too scared to say anything. You did what we couldn't. Similar messages followed throughout the day. Pilots, instructors, even some senior officers expressing private support for the review findings. But support from the sidelines wouldn't be enough when Wilson began his counterattack. That evening, Emily returned to her apartment to find her neighbor, Mrs. Davidson, waiting in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Emily, dear, there were some men here earlier asking questions about you. They said they were from the base, conducting some kind of background check." Emily's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, you know, how long you'd lived here, whether you'd had any visitors, if you'd ever seemed unstable," was the word they used. "I told them you were the most reliable tenant in the building, but they seemed very interested in your personal life." Emily thanked Mrs. Davidson and retreated to her apartment, her mind racing. A background investigation could only mean one thing. Wilson was preparing to challenge her credibility by questioning her psychological fitness. It was exactly the same tactic that had been used 8 years ago: paint the whistleblower as mentally unstable, and the whistle becomes irrelevant. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her small balcony, looking out over the lights of Fort Rucker. Somewhere out there, Wilson was planning his next move. But for the first time since her father's death, Emily felt ready for whatever came next. The wooden box containing her father's wings sat on her coffee table, opened for the first time in months. She'd taken them out that morning before the review meeting, needing their presence as a reminder of who she used to be, who she was meant to be. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Emily, this is General Patricia Hayes. I heard about today's review meeting." Emily straightened. Her father's old friend sounded different, not disapproving, but surprised. "Patricia, I hope I haven't caused any problems." "Problems? Honey, you've caused a revolution. Half the Pentagon is talking about the Fort Rucker review. Your analysis is being circulated at the highest levels." Emily felt a mix of pride and terror.
"I just wanted to fix the training protocols. You've done more than that."
"You've exposed systemic flaws that go beyond Fort Rucker." "But Emily..." Patricia's voice grew serious. "Wilson has friends in high places. He's not going to take this lying down." "Are you prepared for what's coming?" Emily looked at her father's wings, gleaming in the lamplight. "I've been preparing my whole life, Patricia. I just didn't know it until now." "Good, because tomorrow the real fight begins." As Emily hung up the phone, she realized she was no longer afraid. For 8 years, she'd lived in fear of exposure, of failure, of being forced to confront the dreams she'd abandoned. But standing up to Wilson had awakened something in her that fear couldn't touch. She was Emily Carter, daughter of Colonel James Carter, trained Apache pilot, and the woman who had just declared war on a system that had tried to erase her. Let Wilson bring his friends and his institutional power. She had something more important: the truth, and finally the courage to fight for it. The gathering storm was about to break, and Emily intended to be standing in the center of it when it did. The counterattack, Emily's vindication, lasted exactly 18 hours. She arrived at work Thursday morning to find her keycard deactivated and her office sealed with official tape marked "Pending Investigation." A security guard she'd known for 3 years avoided eye contact as he handed her a formal notice requiring her to report to the base commander's office at 0900. The administrative building felt different as Emily walked. Its corridors, whispers followed her passage, and conversation stopped when she appeared. Word of the previous day's review had spread through Fort Rucker like wildfire, and she could feel the weight of scrutiny from everyone she passed. Base Commander Colonel Michael Torres was a career officer with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in combat zones. He gestured for Emily to sit across from his desk, where a thick folder waited with her name on the tab. "Miss Carter, we need to discuss some serious concerns that have come to light about your conduct."
And psychological stability. Emily's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady.
"Sir, what specific concerns?" Torres opened the folder, revealing what looked like witness statements and psychological evaluations. "Multiple reports suggest you've been accessing simulation systems without authorization, conducting unauthorized aircraft operations, and exhibiting behavior consistent with obsessive-compulsive tendencies related to past trauma." The accusations hit like physical blows. Emily recognized Wilson's strategy immediately. He couldn't attack her technical competence, so he was attacking her mental fitness. "Sir, I've never conducted unauthorized aircraft operations. My access to the simulators was part of routine maintenance." Routine? Maintenance that included running complex flight scenarios after hours? For years? Torres pulled out a report Emily recognized as bearing Wilson's signature. "Commander Wilson has documented numerous instances of you remaining in the simulator bay well past your shift, with system logs showing complex training programs being executed." Emily felt the walls closing in. Wilson had been watching her, documenting her private sessions, the ones that had kept her sane and her skills sharp during 7 years of exile. "Colonel, those sessions were how I stayed current with system updates. I needed to understand how the aircraft performed to properly maintain the simulators." "Miss Carter," Torres said, his voice not unkind but firm, "you're a civilian contractor hired to perform basic maintenance. Running unauthorized flight simulations suggests an unhealthy obsession with a career you were medically discharged from 8 years ago." The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be dangerous. Emily had been obsessed with staying connected to aviation, with maintaining skills she wasn't supposed to use, with preparing for a moment she hadn't even known would come. "Sir, my medical discharge was—" "Yes, I've reviewed that file as well." Torres pulled out another document. "Stress-related psychological complications following your father's death. The discharge was voluntary to prevent your situation from worsening." Emily stared at the papers, seeing her life reduced to clinical phrases and administrative decisions. "Colonel, that discharge was coerced. I was told if I didn't accept it voluntarily, they would find other ways to remove me from the program." Torres's expression softened slightly. "Miss Carter, I understand this is painful, but yesterday's outburst during the review meeting, combined with these behavioral patterns, suggests you may be experiencing a recurrence of the psychological issues that led to your original discharge." Outburst? Emily couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. "I presented technical data that multiple experts validated. How is that an outburst? You challenged a senior officer's professional judgment in front of Pentagon officials based on unauthorized knowledge gained through improper access to military systems." Torres leaned forward. "Miss Carter, I'm recommending you undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation before any decisions are made about your continued employment or involvement." In the training review, Emily felt the trap closing around her. A psychological evaluation would take weeks, during which Wilson's flawed training protocols would continue destroying pilot careers. By the time she was cleared, if she was cleared, the review would be over and Wilson would have had time to solidify his position. "Colonel, with respect, this appears to be retaliation for identifying serious flaws in the training program. Commander Wilson is trying to discredit me because he can't refute my technical analysis." Torres closed the folder. "Miss Carter, that's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence that Commander Wilson is acting inappropriately?" Emily hesitated. She had suspicions, circumstantial evidence, patterns of behavior, but nothing that would constitute proof in a formal investigation. Wilson was too smart for that. No, sir, not proof. Then I suggest you focus on addressing the legitimate concerns about your conduct, rather than making unfounded accusations against a decorated officer. Emily left the meeting with her employment suspended pending psychological evaluation, and a formal gag order preventing her from discussing the training review with anyone outside the official investigation. Wilson had played his hand perfectly. He couldn't silence her expertise, but he could silence her. That afternoon, Emily sat in her apartment, staring at the official documents that effectively ended her involvement in the review. Her phone had been ringing constantly, Dr. Sullivan from Boeing, Major Chen, even Colonel Martinez, but the gag order prevented her from taking their calls. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Lieutenant Rodriguez standing in the hallway, still in uniform but looking nervous. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me coming by."
I heard about what happened. Emily glanced around the hallway, then quickly ushered Rodriguez inside. "Lieutenant, you shouldn't be here. If Wilson finds out," "Ma'am, with respect, I don't care what Wilson finds out." Rodriguez's voice carried a
determination that reminded Emily of herself at that age. "What you did yesterday, standing up for the truth, it meant something. To all of us, it didn't accomplish anything except getting me suspended. That's not true." Rodriguez pulled out her phone and showed Emily a group text thread. "This is from candidates across 3 training groups. Everyone's talking about what you revealed. Some of the instructors are starting to ask questions too." Emily scrolled through the messages, seeing names she recognized from pilots she'd watched struggle with Wilson's impossible scenarios. They were sharing stories, comparing experiences, beginning to understand that their failures weren't due to lack of skill, but flawed training. "Lieutenant, you need to be careful. Wilson will retaliate against anyone he perceives as supporting me. Maybe. But some things are worth the risk." Rodriguez met Emily's eyes. "My grandfather flew helicopters in Vietnam. He always told me that flying was about bringing everyone home, safely. Wilson's system isn't preparing us to do that. It's teaching us to fail." After Rodriguez left, Emily found herself thinking about her father again. What would he do in this situation? How would he fight back against institutional power, determined to silence him? The answer came to her as she was looking through his old flight logs preserved in the wooden box with his wings. Her father had been meticulous about documentation, recording not just flight details but maintenance issues, safety concerns, and recommendations for improvement. He'd never just complained, he'd always offered solutions. Emily opened her laptop and began typing. If Wilson wanted to make this about her psychological fitness, she would give the review board something more compelling than personal attacks to consider. She would document every pilot who had been negatively affected by the flawed training protocols, every safety concern the modified parameters created, every potential real-world consequence of Wilson's approach. She would build a case so comprehensive and devastating that her personal credibility would become irrelevant compared to the weight of evidence. Working through the night, Emily compiled testimonials from pilots, submitted anonymously through Rodriguez, technical data from Boeing and Lockheed Martin's own testing, and comparative analysis showing how Wilson's modifications deviated from NATO training standards used by Allied forces. By morning, she had a document that transformed the debate from Emily Carter versus Paul Wilson to evidence-based training versus ego-driven experimentation. The question now was how to get it to the review board without violating her gag order. Emily smiled grimly as she sealed the document in an envelope addressed to Dr. Sullivan at Boeing. The gag order prevented her from discussing the review with anyone outside the official investigation. But Dr. Sullivan was part of the official investigation, and Emily had always been very good at finding loopholes in regulations. Wilson had won the first round of his counterattack, but Emily was her father's daughter, and she was just getting started. The war wasn't over. It was escalating. The underground Dr. Rebecca Sullivan received Emily's package on a Friday morning at Boeing's Mesa facility, 2 hours before she was scheduled to testify before a Pentagon review board about the Fort Rucker training protocols. Inside the manila envelope was a USB drive and a note written in Emily's precise handwriting. Dr. Sullivan, per your request during our meeting, attached is additional technical data relevant to the Apache training system review. This information was compiled using only publicly available sources and my own technical analysis. I believe you'll find it useful for your testimony. E. Carter. Sullivan plugged in the drive and began reading. What she found was devastating. Emily had assembled a comprehensive case file that went far beyond the technical discrepancies identified in the original review. She documented a pattern of pilot failures that correlated directly with Wilson's. Parameter modifications traced the psychological impact of impossible scenarios on candidate confidence and demonstrated how the flawed training could create dangerous knowledge gaps in actual combat situations. Most damning of all, she'd identified 3 recent Apache accidents in overseas deployments where pilot error appeared to be linked to inadequate training in scenarios that Wilson's system would have prepared them for, if it had been properly calibrated. Sullivan immediately called her team lead. "Jim, we need to talk. The Fort Rucker situation is worse than we thought." Meanwhile, at Fort Rucker, Wilson was conducting his own damage control campaign. He'd scheduled individual meetings with every member of the review board, painting Emily as an unstable former pilot whose obsession with her failed career had led to increasingly erratic behavior. "I've been concerned about Miss Carter for months," he told Colonel Martinez during their private session. "Her after-hours activities in the simulator bay, her confrontational attitude toward established protocols, her inability to accept feedback from qualified aviation professionals, all classic signs of someone struggling with unresolved trauma." Martinez listened politely but said little. She'd been studying Emily's technical analysis and finding it difficult to reconcile the precise, methodical work with Wilson's portrait of an unstable, obsessive commander. Putting aside personal concerns, how do you address the technical issues Miss Carter identified? The discrepancies between your parameters and manufacturer specifications are quite significant. Wilson had prepared for this question. "Colonel, those modifications represent advanced training techniques developed through extensive combat experience. The enemy doesn't fight according to manufacturer specifications. We need pilots who can succeed when systems fail, when conditions exceed normal parameters. But the failure rates suggest your techniques aren't producing those results. The failure rates reflect the reality that not everyone is cut out for combat aviation. Better to identify weaknesses in training than lose pilots in combat." It was a persuasive argument, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own expertise. But Martinez had spent enough time in combat zones to know the difference between challenging training and impossible scenarios. After Wilson left, she called Dr. Sullivan's office. "Rebecca, I understand you have additional information about the Fort Rucker protocols." "That's an understatement, Colonel. When are you back at the Pentagon? We need to discuss this in person." That afternoon, Emily received an unexpected visitor. Major David Chen stood at her apartment door in civilian clothes, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Miss Carter, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to discuss the review process with you." Emily hesitated. Her gag order was explicit about not discussing the review with investigation personnel, but Chen was part of the official team. Major, I'm not sure I should. You're not sure you should talk to a member of the review board about technical matters relevant to our investigation? Chen smiled slightly. That seems odd, considering you're listed as a consulting expert. Emily invited him in, recognizing a lifeline when she saw, 1. Major, I assume you've heard about my suspension and the psychological evaluation requirement? Chen nodded grimly. I've also heard about your additional analysis that Dr. Sullivan presented to the Pentagon Review Board this morning. Impressive work. You saw it? Miss Carter, that document is currently being circulated at the highest levels of military aviation. Your correlation between training parameter modifications and subsequent pilot performance in theater is the kind of analysis we should have been doing all along. Emily felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. What happens now? Now we determine whether the Army is more interested in protecting institutional authority or fixing fundamental problems with pilot training. Chen leaned forward. But I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest. Okay, those after-hours simulator sessions Wilson documented, what were you actually doing? Emily had dreaded this question, but Chen's direct approach demanded an equally direct answer. I was flying, Major. Complex combat scenarios, emergency procedures, advanced tactical situations. Everything I should have been doing as an active Apache pilot for the past 8 years, and your skill level? Honestly, Emily met his eyes without hesitation. I'm better now than I was when I was discharged. I've had 8 years to study every advancement in Apache technology, every tactical development, every lesson learned from combat deployments. I know these aircraft better than most active pilots. Chen nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Miss Carter, hypothetically speaking, if a situation arose requiring someone with exceptional Apache piloting skills, someone who could execute missions that other pilots couldn't, would you be capable of flying such missions? The question sent a chill through Emily. Major, are you asking me hypothetically or specifically? I'm asking because there's something you need to know. Weather conditions in the region have been deteriorating rapidly. If we get the kind of emergency extraction scenario that occasionally occurs during training exercises, we might need every qualified pilot available. Emily stared at him, understanding the subtext. Major, I'm not current, not certified, not officially qualified. Miss Carter, in an emergency, the only qualification that matters is whether you can bring people home alive. Everything else is paperwork. After Chen left, Emily sat in her kitchen, processing the implications of their conversation. For 8 years, she'd maintained her skills in secret, preparing for a moment she'd convinced herself would never come. Now that moment was approaching, and she found herself terrified by the possibility of finally proving what she'd always known about herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rodriguez. Heard about Dr. Sullivan's presentation to the Pentagon. The word is spreading. Wilson's been calling emergency meetings all day. Something big is happening. Emily looked out her window toward Fort Rucker, where lights were burning in administrative buildings well past normal hours. Wilson was clearly in crisis mode, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the real crisis was yet to come. That evening, she opened her father's wooden box again and held his pilot wings. For 8 years, they'd been a reminder of dreams deferred. Tonight, they felt like a promise about to be fulfilled. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Emily, this is General Patricia Hayes. We need to talk. Immediately. Patricia, what's wrong? There's a weather system moving into the region that's going to create some very dangerous conditions, the kind that might require exceptional piloting skills to handle. Emily's blood ran cold. Are you saying I'm saying that sometimes the universe
has a way of putting people exactly where they need to be when they need to be there? Are you ready, Emily?
Looking at her father's wings, Emily realized she'd been ready for 8 years. She just hadn't known it until now. Yes, she said quietly. I'm ready. The underground resistance she'd unknowingly built was about to become very visible. And Emily Carter was about to discover whether 8 years of preparation had been enough to change everything. The storm breaks. The emergency alert sounded at 0347 hours Saturday morning, jolting Emily from restless sleep. Her apartment's emergency notification system crackled to life with a message that made her blood freeze. All Fort Rucker personnel, this is base command. We have a code red emergency situation, training exercise. Bravo 7 has encountered severe weather complications. Ground team is stranded and requires immediate air extraction. All available aviation assets report to Emergency Operations Center immediately. Emily was reaching for her phone when it rang. Miss Carter, this is Colonel Martinez. I need you at the Emergency Operations Center in 15 minutes. Colonel, I'm suspended from... The suspension is temporarily lifted under emergency protocols. We have 22 soldiers stranded in the Talladega Mountains with hypothermia conditions developing rapidly. Every available asset is being mobilized. Emily threw on clothes and drove to the base through pre-dawn darkness, her mind racing. As she entered the Emergency Operations Center, she found controlled chaos, weather displays showing a massive storm system, communication feeds crackling with updates from the stranded team, and senior officers huddled around tactical displays. Major. Chen approached her immediately. Emily, I need you to look at this weather data and tell me if an extraction is possible. The main display showed conditions that made Emily's heart sink. Winds gusting to 70 knots, visibility near zero, severe turbulence extending from ground level to 8,000 feet. The kind of weather that grounded even the most experienced pilots. It's marginal at best, she said, after studying the data. The wind shear patterns would make a standard approach impossible. What about a non-standard approach? The voice came from behind her. Emily turned to see Wilson striding across the operations center, his expression grim but focused. For a moment, their personal conflict seemed irrelevant compared to the emergency unfolding. There might be a way, Emily said carefully. The Western Valley approach could work if you can maintain precise altitude control and use the ridgeline as a wind buffer. But it would require flying entirely on instruments through terrain with minimal clearance margins. Wilson studied the tactical display. I've got 3 Apache crews standing by. Who's qualified for that kind of precision flying in these conditions? Emily looked around the room at the assembled pilots, all competent aviators, but none with the kind of advanced instrument flying experience required for the approach she was envisioning. Major Chen spoke quietly.
Emily, could you execute that approach? The question hung in the air like a live grenade. Every eye in the room turned to her. Wilson's expression shifted from focus to shock as the implications sank in. Wait a minute, Wilson said. Are you suggesting?
We put a civilian contractor with no current flight status into an Apache in these conditions. I'm suggesting, Colonel Martinez said, entering the conversation, that we use every available resource to save 22 lives. Miss Carter, what's your honest assessment of your ability to fly that mission? Emily looked at the weather data, thought about 8 years of midnight simulator sessions, and realized that her entire life had been leading to this moment. Colonel, I can fly that mission. Wilson stepped forward, his voice sharp with disbelief. This is insane. She hasn't flown
an actual Apache in 8 years.
She's not current, not certified, not qualified for combat conditions. Commander Wilson, Martinez interrupted. In an emergency, our priority is mission success, not regulatory compliance. Miss Carter has demonstrated exceptional systems knowledge
and has maintained her skills through extensive simulation training. Simulation isn't reality.
Wilson's voice rose. You're talking about sending an unstable civilian into the worst flying conditions we've seen in years. I'm talking about sending the person most qualified to execute the required approach, Martinez replied coolly. Unless you're volunteering to fly the mission yourself? Wilson's face flushed. I would if the conditions allowed for a standard approach, but they don't. Miss Carter, can you be ready to fly in 30 minutes? Emily felt the weight of 22 lives settling on her shoulders. Yes, ma'am. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Emily changed into a flight suit that felt both foreign and familiar, reviewed weather updates and terrain maps, and ran through emergency procedures with the extraction team. Throughout it all, Wilson watched with a mixture of anger and disbelief, clearly hoping she would lose her nerve and back down. But as Emily walked toward Apache 27, the aircraft that had been prepared for the mission, she felt only calm certainty. This was what she'd been preparing for, even when she didn't know it. The pre-flight check was automatic, muscle memory taking over as her hands moved across familiar controls. Starting the engines, feeling the massive rotors begin their rotation, sensing the aircraft's readiness. It was like greeting an old friend she'd been separated from for too long. Apache 27, this is Control. Weather conditions have deteriorated further. Recommend final mission assessment before proceeding. Wilson's voice came through her headset, making one last attempt to stop her. Miss Carter, abort criteria have been exceeded. No responsible pilot would attempt this mission. Emily adjusted her helmet and keyed her radio. Control, this is Apache 27. Mission is a go. 22 lives are worth the risk. As she lifted off into the storm, Emily left behind 8 years of silence, invisibility, and doubt. The woman who had been pushed out of aviation was gone. In her place was someone who had earned her wings not through politics or institutional approval, but through pure, undeniable competence. The flight to the extraction zone tested every skill she'd developed. Visibility was essentially zero, forcing her to navigate entirely by instruments through terrain that left no margin for error. Wind shear rocked the Apache violently, requiring constant corrections to maintain stable flight. But Emily found herself in complete control, her body responding to the aircraft's movements with practiced precision. Every adjustment was calculated, every response automatic. She was exactly where she belonged, not despite being a woman, not because of special consideration, but because she was simply the best pilot for this mission. When she finally reached the stranded team and established a stable hover despite winds that had defeated all previous rescue attempts, Emily realized that Vindication wasn't about proving her critics wrong. It was about proving herself right. Control, this is Apache 27 on station and ready for extraction. Let's bring our people home. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything else had been preparation for this, the chance to demonstrate beyond any doubt what she'd always known about herself. She was Emily Carter. She was an Apache pilot. And she was exactly where she needed to be. Coming home, the extraction took 4 hours of the most demanding flying Emily had ever experienced. Each trip through the mountain corridor required the same intense concentration, the same precise instrument navigation, the same split-second corrections to counter wind shear that could slam the Apache into a mountainside. But with each successful run, lifting 6 soldiers at a time to safety, Emily felt pieces of herself falling back into place, pieces that had been scattered 8 years ago when institutional prejudice and personal tragedy had convinced her she didn't belong in the sky. By the time she set Apache 27 down at Fort Rucker for the final time, having delivered all 22 soldiers safely home, Emily discovered that the woman who climbed out of the cockpit was different from the one who had climbed in. She'd shed 8 years of doubt, of hiding, of accepting other people's definitions of who she was supposed to be. A crowd had gathered on the tarmac, base personnel, rescued soldiers, instructors, and pilots. As Emily removed her helmet and walked across the landing pad, they began to applaud. Not the polite acknowledgement given to adequate performance, but the kind of sustained ovation reserved for something truly exceptional. Among the crowd stood Wilson, his expression unreadable. When the applause finally died down and others had moved away, he approached her with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "That was exceptional flying, Miss Carter," he said quietly. "I was wrong about your capabilities." Emily studied his face, seeing genuine respect mixed with something that might have been regret. "Thank you, Commander. About the training protocols, your analysis..." Wilson cleared his throat. "The review board is implementing your recommendations." "All of them." Emily nodded, accepting his concession without gloating. The protocols needed to be fixed. It was never personal, wasn't it? Wilson's voice carried a note of curiosity rather than challenge. "You could have stayed invisible, kept your head down, avoided all of this. Why didn't you?" Emily looked up at the Apache helicopter that had carried her through the storm and back to herself. "Because sometimes staying invisible means watching other people get hurt. And I couldn't do that anymore." Dr. Sullivan approached as Wilson walked away. "Emily, that was the finest display of helicopter piloting I've witnessed in 20 years of aviation. Boeing would like to offer you a position as a senior flight test consultant." "Thank you, but I think I need to stay here." Colonel Martinez joined them, extending her hand to Emily. "Miss Carter, the Army would like to discuss your return to active
duty. Your performance today demonstrates that your skills are not only current, but exceptional." Emily shook the colonel's hand, but her attention was drawn to a young female lieutenant who had been watching from the edge of the crowd.
Rodriguez approached hesitantly, her eyes bright with something between admiration and hope. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, "what you did today, the flying, yes, but also standing up for what was right when everyone told you to be quiet. That's why I joined aviation. To become that kind of pilot." Emily reached into her flight suit pocket and withdrew the small wooden box she'd carried with her into the cockpit. Inside were her father's pilot wings, the ones she'd kept hidden for 8 years. She pressed them into Rodriguez's hands. These belonged to Colonel James Carter, one of the finest Apache pilots who ever lived. He believed that flying wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of what a pilot should be. It was about bringing everyone home safely, whatever it takes. Rodriguez's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of the gift. "Ma'am, I can't..." "Yes, you can. And you will. Wear them with pride and never let anyone tell you what you can't do." As Rodriguez walked away, clutching the wings with reverent care, Emily felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle was complete. The torch passed to the next generation of aviators who would face their own battles against doubt and institutional resistance. Colonel Martinez approached again. "Emily, about returning to active duty..." "Colonel, I'm honored by the offer, but I think I can do more good right here. Training the next generation, ensuring the protocols serve pilots instead of politics, making sure no one else has to fight alone the way I did." Martinez nodded understanding. "As you wish, but the Army owes you recognition for today, and for the 8 years you spent in exile for doing nothing wrong." Emily looked around the base that had been her prison and her refuge, her place of exile and her avenue of return. The recognition I needed was proving to myself that I never stopped being who I was meant to be. Everything else is just paperwork. As the crowd dispersed and the immediate crisis faded into bureaucratic follow-up, Emily found herself alone on the tarmac with Apache 27. She ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the vibration of cooling engines and the subtle tremor of rotors winding down. Her phone buzzed with a text message, then another and another. Word of her rescue mission was spreading beyond Fort Rucker, generating calls from news organizations, job offers from aerospace companies, and messages of support from pilots she'd never met. But the message that mattered most came from her old friend Patricia Hayes. "Your father would be proud. You didn't just bring those soldiers home, Emily. You brought yourself home too." Emily smiled, remembering her father's words about the measure of a pilot being what they do when everything goes wrong. For 8 years, everything had been wrong. Her career destroyed, her dreams deferred, her identity hidden. But she'd kept flying anyway, in simulators and in her heart, preparing for a moment she hadn't known would come. Now standing beside the aircraft that had carried her through impossible conditions and back to herself, Emily realized that the greatest victory wasn't proving her critics wrong. It was proving that some things, skill, determination, the courage to do what's right, can't be destroyed by politics or prejudice or time. They can only be forgotten. And Emily Carter had spent 8 years making sure she never forgot who she was. As she walked away from Apache 27 for the last time as a civilian contractor and the first time as something new, not Lieutenant Carter, not Miss Carter, but simply Emily Carter, Apache pilot, she felt the weight of 8 years lifting from her shoulders. The ghost in the machine had finally come home, and she was exactly where she belonged. The end, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice, isn't fighting for acceptance, but quietly maintaining your excellence until the moment comes to demonstrate what everyone should have seen all along. In a world that constantly tells certain people they don't belong, the most revolutionary act is simply being undeniably good at what you do. True strength isn't measured by how loudly you proclaim your abilities, but by the quiet confidence to use them when lives hang in the balance. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our
amazing viewers around the world.